All right, I'm here at the National Conference for Media Reform with Norman Solomon. Norman is, of course, the founding director of the Institute for Public Accuracy. He is the author of countless books and actually the inspiration of an amazing documentary. His latest book is War Made Easy: How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. Norman, thank you for taking the time to talk with me here.
It's a pleasure, Matt. Thanks.
So I watched your panel earlier today, and it really is horrific. The march to war that has cost countless American lives, countless lives around the world, and the real fault that the mainstream media has played a part in that. So discuss that a bit, and just how the media has, I mean, not even failed, but been willing conspirators in the march to war.
Well, as you said it well, it is a march to war, kind of a forced march in retrospect, because so much pressure is exerted by the major players, which include mass media and elected officials. You know, if you want to think about those who now are in prominence in policy, John Kerry, the new Secretary of State, was very adamant in favor of the invasion of Iraq. So was his predecessor in the Secretary of State's office as a U.S. Senator, Hillary Clinton, Joe Biden, the vice president, as well. Barack Obama was not in Washington at that point. He was a rising star in Illinois and spoke against the war, but in preponderance, the policymakers then as now in Washington, Republicans then, Democrats now, but tremendous overlap. There's been enthusiasm, albeit with such misgivings at times, but enthusiasm for one war after another. It's sort of like serial warfare, and I think of it as a spin cycle that continues with a somewhat intricate but ultimately very definitive dance where the mass media and politicians move along to one war after another.
How have we as a society allowed the media to get to that point? I mean, it seems where, I mean, I guess when the invasion of Iraq happened, you know, the polls were for it, but also people were lied to. There were a lot of, but there were also millions and millions of anti-war protesters everywhere, which also the mainstream media completely ignored. But how have we allowed the media to get to this point?
Well, I think that the ultimate role of the news media, with some exceptions, has been to mirror and echo what's coming out of high offices in Washington. And the net result of that is you do develop this sort of echo chamber where the voices and sounds and drum beats for war get amplified and bounce off the echo chambers walls continually. And so it becomes normalized more and more. And people have misgivings, tend to be drowned out, not invited or not invited back into the major media outlets. And so it's sort of a sifting process. And unfortunately, it's become so normalized because when you think of it, you know, when is the last time in U.S. history when war has not only been continuous for so long, but there's no end in sight and no expectation or even public discourse about when war might end? I mean, basically, October 2001, warfare began, has never ended, and now we don't even hear or talk about, hey, when do you think this war is going to end? Because it's almost tacitly but explicitly understood to be endless.
Yeah, and another very disturbing thing that I think that Obama has done well, and when I say well, in a bad way, is the shift to, you know, obviously drone warfare and kind of, you know, moving troops out of harm's way, but still continuing perpetual war. But it really, the country doesn't really think about it anymore because we aren't having the massive body counts that we had with the Iraq war. But it's still war by any definition at all. But also we haven't actually declared war in the countries that we're doing these drone attacks in at all.
Yes, very much the visibility is reduced. And in Afghanistan, as the troops have been withdrawn, the air war has increased. And this is a historic pattern where the drone warfare has really escalated during the last several years, even while the surge of troops has now been reversed, and slowly, very slowly, because there are more troops in Afghanistan now than when Obama took office, we're on a trajectory, we're told, for the next couple of years in which all the U.S. troops will be withdrawn. But it's almost an anesthetic applied to the news media as the U.S. deaths drop, to say, hey, not to worry. You can sort of numb yourself up, so to speak. Don't be concerned. Don't feel sensitized to the loss of life because, and this is said tacitly, implicitly, not directly, after all, it's Afghans who are dying, not Americans. At the end of last year, USA Today had a story which said, hey, and I'm paraphrasing, but this was the gist, really good news. Afghan government troops are dying now at a rate of 10 times American troops as U.S. casualties drop. And that was celebrated as a good thing. There's a historical parallel where in mid-1969, President Nixon announced the beginning, which turned out to be a very long withdrawal of U.S. troops. From mid-69 to mid-72, about 500,000 troop level drop from 550,000 to about 69,000. So one would look at those numbers and say, wow, this is a de-escalation of the war, going from more than 500,000 to about 70,000 U.S. troops on the ground in Vietnam. Well, during that period, actually, the rate of bombing by the U.S. in Vietnam actually increased. So the experience of people on the ground is that the tonnage of bombs falling on them is actually skyrocketing.
Mm-hmm. And again, you see the parallel that's happening again right now. While the bombs are increasing, while the U.S. troop deaths are going a lot less.
Yes, and so much of it is, and there's this insidious motto in Washington, perception is reality. Well, for some people it is, if you're not under the bombs, but facts on the ground are so often very differently experienced by U.S. soldiers and certainly people living in the country that's being attacked. And so the net effect is that words do begin to approach a sort of Orwellian horizon where it doesn't matter so much the implicit message is what the policy actually is. It matters the window dressing and the words used to describe the policy.
Again, it goes back to, we just had the 10-year anniversary of the Iraq War, the beginning of the Iraq War, obviously. It's, and how much fault the media really was in going up to that. A lot of people worry that, again, not that war isn't going on now, because it is going on now, but that, there's, constant saber rattling about Iran, in numerous other countries where potentially it could begin in a day. How to discuss a little bit about the media's complicity and crimes in this regard?
Well, a couple of the big factors, I think, are first, a shared set of assumptions that if the reporters and pundits on the whole in the major mass media share a similar window on the world and perspective of U.S. proper prerogatives than, say, U.S. high officials in Washington, then there's sort of a confluence and connection in how options are even portrayed in the mass media, and of course that has an effect on the public. Also, there's a enormous problem where we get into a spin cycle, and the power of media is based largely on repetition. I mean, think about it. If one does watch TV a fair amount, does one see only one McDonald's commercial? I don't think so. The essence of propaganda is repetition, and so the drumbeat, the code words, the catchphrases that are repeated when there is agenda building for war, which is part of the spin cycle. We certainly lived through that in 2002 and early 2003 before the invasion of Iraq. And I think it's fair to say that we've undergone that in the last couple of years and more vis-a-vis a possible attack on Iran. Every war and every build-up to war is different in some ways, but still there's a commonality, that spin cycle. Sometimes it's real sudden, sometimes it's a matter of months or years. North Korea, we're getting a lot of build-up now, and the problem is often that the U.S. prerogatives are taken as a given, and the messaging to the U.S. public is, of course, they're bad, we're good, without acknowledging that from the vantage point of the other side, we are making menacing moves. And so, for instance, the recent war games implemented between the U.S. government and the South Korean government on one hand clearly preparing for, through the eyes of the North Korean government, a possible attack. I mean, there's no bones about it. These are war games,
right.
Simulating possible even nuclear attack on Korea. So, North Korea. And so the net effect is that we've got this do as we say, not as we do messaging to other countries. And unfortunately, Americans are conditioned to believe that not only are we the center of the world, but probably the light onto the world,
right.
And butter won't melt in our mouth, and we do good as a matter of course. If only that were so.
Absolutely. And before I let you go, discuss a little bit about just, I think fairly obviously all war and the military industrial complex, it all goes down to money. It all goes down to a very small percentage of people setting the agenda to make money off of the blood of Americans and off the blood of whatever country that these small amount of people decide to slaughter in order for them to make their billions.
Yes, when I was working on my book, War Made Easy, I was at the time, before Rupert Murdoch bought it, that is, a subscriber to the Wall Street Journal, and I would get in the mail these handy-dandy checkoff forms where there'd be literally hundreds of companies that would send, if you check the box, their annual report. So I went through the category for all the aerospace and military contracting corporations and got just huge stacks of annual reports in, small, medium, and large Pentagon contractors. And a commonality, and keep in mind this was, 2 or 3 years after 9/11, so many of those annual reports said, one way or another, to the readers and prospective investors, we believe that our market share prospects are very good. This market is expanding. The war on terror will be very good for our company. And they were selling everything from military uniforms to machine guns to M16s, rocket launchers, whatever you can imagine, airplanes, huge bombers. These were very exciting times from the vantage point of the investors and those who were trying to get more money into the company because the profits were seen to be very prolific. And in fact, they have been. And the military budget is now, when you take all the items, not just the Defense Department, but military weapons outside, such as nuclear weapons not within the DoD budget, other special expenditures for war, we're talking about $3 billion with a B dollars a day. And a lot of that money shakes out into a lot of private hands. And so when Martin Luther King talked about what he called the madness of militarism, in a way he was describing what President Dwight Eisenhower called the military-industrial complex during his farewell presidential address in early 1961. And you gotta say that several decades later, that military-industrial complex is larger, more powerful, and more pernicious than ever. So as always, it's really up to us as people living in this country to understand better what's at stake, because our futures are at stake as well as so many others, and to organize, because that's really how change takes place.
Norman Solomon, the co-founder of the founding director of the Institute for Public Accuracy, the author of many books. The latest is War Made Easy: How Presidents and Pundits Keep Spinning Us to Death. Really, your work is inspiring. If anyone hasn't seen the documentary Body of War, or they should read the book first, but they should also see the documentary because it's phenomenal. But thank you so much for all your work, and thank you for taking the time to talk to me today.
Oh, thanks, Matt. Glad you're here.